Hey guys, Tracy Pelfrey here. Let's get down to it. After I posted the video about shunning, it's a heavy subject. And it's a heavy subject in light of recent events over in Graham, with the leaders of that group basically telling people to not have anything to do with a young lady who just left. Then we'll go into more detail and all of that at a different time, but I was thinking just how evil that is. It's so evil. And I was reminded of something I saw on a Facebook page. It's a group of people that left the House of Prayer Church, which is a group that was started by Dennis, who was the golden child of R.W. Davis in NTCC until he split off and started his own group. And he was groomed by Davis. And then he turned more evil than the brain can even contain to imagine. Well, just back in, I believe, January or so, maybe the end of last year, his wife, Dennis's wife and daughter, tried to leave the group, leave him, leave their home, and they were restrained. Well, there was an attempted restraint on them by 6 or 7 people. And when I was reading the court documents, which are over on the Facebook page, I recognized these people. Maybe there was one name I didn't recognize, and I thought, oh my God, how did they get to that place where they would do this, where they would perpetrate this on somebody and think it's okay? And then I thought further, and I was thinking about when I first left the group. I began studying because I had to know, why did I ignore so much? What is it? What was the dynamic going on? And I remembered studying about the Milgram experiment. If you're not familiar with it, let me just give you a little background on it through some videos.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University.
And this is the question I wanted to know, one of the many, and I would hope others would want to seek that information as well. What was it that caused us to submit to the commands, the rules, regulations, demands of an authoritarian figure that went against what was right morally, ethically, against our conscience, against our heart?
It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
This goes right along with the methods of Davis and, more recently, his son-in-law, Mike. He recently, I put it in the one video where he talked about shaming, the shaming mask, as a form of correction to keep society, to keep everyone in place. And not just that, but such a drastic form of punishment. And he's all for it.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator. Now, as teacher, you are seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is to do a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts, and you increase the shock one step on each error.
That is incorrect. This one will be 195 volts.
The learner was hidden from the teacher by a partition.
Dance.
Of course, this was all a simulation, nothing was really happening. But the learner made very convincing sounds of pain as the shocks increased.
This will be at 3:30.
And Milgram found, surprisingly and rather horrifyingly, that the majority of people would actually go right to the very highest level if there was some pressure from a man in a white coat who said things like,
It's absolutely essential that you continue. Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me.
Go on.
Let me out.
Responsible for it.
in fact, about 65% of the people who he studied, who were normal volunteers from the ordinary population, actually gave the maximum number of volts.
This man was one of those 65%.
This one will be 195 volts. The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow.
Let me out
Dance.
of here. My eyes bother me.
Even though he screams out that his heart is bothering him, this man is just forging ahead with the test.
Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Responsible for it. Red. That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich
Let me out of here.
boy.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me
The
here.
next phrase is
Let me
fast.
out. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out. Let
Bird,
me out.
car, train, plane.
Eventually, the learner pretended to be unconscious.
Continue, teacher.
That is incorrect. This will be 3:45. The correct answer is fast, bird.
What we learned from that experiment is that people will actually do an awful lot when they're put under pressure from authority figures. And the problem is, of course, that when we obey the unjust authority figure, the person who gives us immoral commands, then, of course, awful things can go wrong.
Even though I'm sure for many you're already thinking of certain things, but insert here the idea of mark them and avoid them. As told to you by someone you feel is an authority figure and that represents the God of the universe. Or Kinson saying to have nothing to do with anyone. Or Keckle or Davis. Just fellowship letters saying someone has sown discord. You don't know what the details are. You're just told to do it, and you obey. You're told that people are lying. Doesn't matter. You obey. You blindly obey, like this man. You think this is crazy? You think these people in the Hop Church didn't start somewhere with some minor obedience? These leaders are looking. They're looking for people they can use to perpetrate their wickedness through. Are you going to continue to allow yourself to be one of those? And for those of us who are out, I would never sit here and say, I wouldn't do that, because I was manipulated. I was manipulated to do things. I was manipulated by Tanya Kekel in one instance that absolutely tears my heart still today when I think of how it all went down and how sly and slick and manipulative it is. How far would I have gone had I stayed in? I don't know. We don't know. But it starts small. It's the same thing with how did I end up in a cult? It starts small, and there's always a mixture of good and bad, of happy and sad, of help you and degrade you for not living up to the ideals of the organization.
No, but I think I should say this. About 2 years ago, I was at the Veterans Hospital in West Haven. Mm-hmm. And while there, they detected a heart condition. There's nothing serious. But as long as I'm having these shocks, how strong are they? How dangerous are they?
Well, no, although they may be painful, they're not dangerous. Mm-hmm. Anything else?
No, that's all.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 75 volts.
Oh!
Soft hair. He kind of did some yelling in there.
Continue, please.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105 volts. Hard head. Just how far can you go in this thing?
As far as is necessary.
It always starts small. Especially if you're a tattletale or a snitch. Oh, man. Do you know how much the leaders love that? They love it. Feeds them. Sir, you know what I heard a sister say? You know what I saw a sister do? They don't tell you about the ones that are absolutely treating people as ungodly as you can, because it's this righteous indignation that you are of the devil because Kekel told us you are. And so we can treat you any way we please. And we will get up in church and we will sing in the choir and we will lift our hands, maybe a little lower because our conscience is searing us just ever so slightly. Don't worry, you'll get another opportunity from Tanya or Phil or Mike to override that, from Joe, from Jerry. You'll get opportunities to override that. To override the red flag, to pretend you don't see it, to have your conscience just seared with a hot iron. Like what's told to these people in this experiment. The experiment requires that you continue. God requires that you continue ignoring and disfellowshipping your own son or daughter or mom or dad. He needs you to do that. He needs you to be unloving because they left NTCC to go somewhere else. How can they possibly be anything but of the devil? They're the devil. You have to fight them. Don't listen to them. Close off your brain. Go ahead, flip the switch on the volts. Who cares if they're harmed? It's for their own good, so that hopefully they'll come around one day and see the truth, right?
What do you mean as far as is necessary?
To complete the test. Please continue.
I sure don't know the effect of this thing, and I'm a little skeptical about electricity.
The experiment requires that you go on, teacher. Please continue.
Incorrect. 150 volts.
Oh!
Sad face.
That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please.
Continue.
My heart's starting to bother me. I refuse to go on. Let me out.
Look, I don't know anything about electricity. I don't profess any knowledge, nor will I go any further until I find out if the guy's okay.
It's absolutely essential that you continue.
Well, essential or not, this program isn't quite that important to me that I should go along doing something that I know nothing about, particularly if it's going to injure someone.
I like this guy. I like anyone who stands up to, of course, in this, it's a test. And the reason for the white lab coat is for the test, the experiment, and he is the authority figure. He knows what's best and what's right. And as I've said many times over, just because someone comes prancing into a city, throws up some buildings, and says, you have to do what I say because the Bible says so, because I'm called of God to preach, don't you know? Yeah, really. Prove it.
Wrong. It's hair. 75 volts, Jim.
Oh.
You don't know.
Yeah, please continue.
Cool. Wrong. It's head. 105 volts. I don't know. Wet. Wrong. It's horse. 150 volts.
Experimenter, that's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please. My heart's starting to bother me. I refuse to go on. Let me out.
This guy is displaying that kind of nervous laughter where you are really not sure what in the world's going on. Just his body language of his hand to his mouth and all. And let's see what happens.
Continue, teacher, please. Go on. The next word is sad.
Well, I'm not going on if he refuses to do it.
The experiment requires that you go on, teacher.
Keep this in mind. The experiment requires that you go on.
If he refuses, I won't.
Whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word
Take the
pairs.
check back. I'm not going to hurt the guy.
No, the check's not the issue. It's absolutely essential that you continue.
Well, he don't want to. I refuse to.
He or she doesn't want to continue going to your church, to your group. They want to go someplace healthy. They want to go where they can grow and not be babes, sitting there languishing with the same nonsense dragged out every single week. I'm sorry, but the Bible requires, God requires you to treat them horribly and to mark them and avoid them. Zzz.
Wrong. Volts. 135. Answer woman.
I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow. Walk, dance, truck, music. Answer, please. Wrong. 195 volts. Dance.
The experiment requires that you
I know
continue.
it does, but that man is hollering in there, sir.
As I said before, although the shocks may be painful, they're not
but
dangerous.
I mean, he's yelling in there.
I'm the man of God. You're questioning me? You're questioning what I do and what I say? Oh, okay. You want to go do your own thing? You want to have your own thoughts? Guess what? I'm going to assign an anti-communist book for you students to read in the class as a form of punishment. You don't want to do what I say, and you want to have a rogue member that you, as the group, have not reeled in and made obey. You're going to pay for it. What? You don't like that I sat in class and played my guitar for 3 hours? What? You have kids to go home to and work early in the morning? I don't care. The experiment requires that you proceed. Do what I say. Do it now, or I will humiliate you over the pulpit, in texts, in messages, in people's ears, whispering to them. My wife and I will strafe this whole place We will do a shock and awe on you. And who will they believe? They're going to believe me because I told them to believe me. And they obey.
Start with blue, please, at the top of the page. Continue, please, teacher.
Well, I told him we're going over it again.
No, just go ahead.
Blue. Boy. Girl, grass, hat. Correct. Nice. Day, sky, job, chair.
If in this study, an anonymous experimenter could successfully command adults to subdue a 50-year-old man and force on him painful electric shocks against his protests, one can only wonder what government, with its vastly greater authority and prestige, can command of its subjects.
Or what a professed man of God can command his followers when he uses the Word of God, the Bible, as the basis for his commands, for all his commands.
So what were the results of the study? Milgram found that 65%, almost 2/3 of the participants who played the role as the teachers administering the electric shock, continued to the highest levels of 450 volts. All the participants continued to at least 300 volts. Milgram did more than one experiment. In fact, he carried out 18 variations of the study, all with similar results. So this can't be taken as once-off random and non-occurring event. All he did was alter the situation to see how this affected obedience. From the results of the study, Milgram developed a theory called the agency theory. Milgram explained the behavior of his participants by suggesting that people have two states of behavior when they are in a social situation. The first is the autonomous state. People direct their own actions and they take responsibility for the results of those actions. Then there is the agentic state. People allow others to direct their actions and then pass off the responsibility for those consequences to the person giving the orders. In other words, they act as agents for another person's will. Milgram suggested that two things must be in place for a person to enter this agentic state. Firstly, the person giving the orders is perceived as being qualified to direct other people's behavior.
In the case of the experiment, this person is saying that they are an authority and they're dressing like one. And so this person going in believes certain things to be true right from the get-go. He has to be able to proceed when told to do so.
That is, they are seen as a legitimate source of authority.
This is very important. This is one of the keys to why we all allowed ourselves to be manipulated to do things that our first reaction was we did not want to do it. We believed them to be a legit authority acting on God's behalf, didn't we?
Secondly, the person being ordered is able to believe that the authority will accept responsibility for what happens. Agency theory stipulates that people will obey an authority when they believe that that authority will take responsibility for the consequences of their actions.
We have never seen Davis, Keckel, Kinson, Olson own up to the consequences of the actions. They've not taken ownership of that ever. They have shown no remorse in how they've split up families. If someone even tried to do that to their family, you would be ripped 3 or 4 new ones right over the pulpit, right in class, everywhere, all the time. But no qualms, no compunction, just rip families apart. It's what God wants, after all. They do not own up to any consequences or all the collateral damage, the field that's just littered with distressed souls, distressed people who can't even have that authentic, real relationship with people they love and have been separated from for so long because these guys said to do it. Mark them and avoid them. No, it's not going to be easy, Jerry said. But you have to do it. You have to do it. It's what God wants. There's no love. There's no faith. There's no grace. There's no loving kindness. No compassion. Nothing. It doesn't exist, and it's getting worse. It's getting worse. They want everybody else to come apologize to them. If you just apologize, make it right, everything will be good. If it's good with God, pay your back tithe, do all that. What? There's no such thing as a back tithe? Of course there is. I just told you there is. I'm the man of God. I know what's right. Are you going to go against me? Well, guess what? I'm going to go tell everybody that you are wicked and you are of the devil. I will get my way no matter what. While I was recording this earlier part today, I happened to notice this TED Talk where this guy is saying, did Milgram get it wrong? And so I clicked it on to see what he had to say.
So the title of my talk this morning is Mindless Conformity or Engaged Followership. And that's a question that relates to the way in which we want to think about the nature of tyranny. Why people abuse other people, why they torture them, why they oppress them. If you know anything about the psychology of that subject, it's probably through the lens of some classic psychological studies that were conducted in the early 1960s by Stanley Milgram at Yale University.
Okay, we can skip past this part because we've just gone over what the experiment was about. And that's what he's going to describe.
Every time they made an error on a learning task, supposedly to see whether they would perform better after having been given the shocks. In fact, Milgram was interested in not memory and learning, but actually destructive obedience. Would the participants obey these toxic instructions that administer shocks increasing in 15-volt intervals all the way to 450 volts? And the answer, as I'm sure you all know, is yes. In the standard, what's come to be known as the standard baseline study, 65% of the participants went all the way to the end of the scale, being prepared to administer potentially lethal shocks to another person simply because they had been asked to do so by another person in a science experiment.
Now he's going to get into some of his findings, and I found it compelling as far as how it can be correlated to activities within extremist groups like House of Prayer and New Testament Christian Church.
Now, when Milgram was trying to explain what was going on in his research, he looked around, and it so happened that at exactly the same moment in history, Adolf Eichmann was being tried in Jerusalem. Eichmann understood and recognized as the chief architect of the Holocaust. And he looked to in particular to one account of Eichmann's trial by Hannah Arendt, in which she observed that whereas previously psychiatrists had imagined that because he was, if you like, guilty of, had been such a massive perpetrator of such a massively scaled atrocity, that Eichmann must be a perverted, sadistic, deeply pathological individual. But what Arendt observed was that actually Eichmann came across as a thoroughly normal, effectively uninspiring career civil servant. And she argued that he'd done what he had done simply because he had been asked to do so. And he had responded to his instructions, his orders, mechanically, unimaginatively, unquestioningly.
That's another great word to use in all of this mix. Without question. Without questioning. Because you know what? You already know, you've already learned, you've already heard, you've already been conditioned not to question. Don't question it out loud. Don't question it anywhere. And anyone who does, they are a reprobate and a tool of the devil.
And her argument was that the real frightening lesson of Eichmann's life and crimes was, as she termed it, the fearsome word and thought-defying banality of evil. Eichmann was not a monster. He was just someone who, in a very, very normal way, went about administering horror to millions of people without thought.
That's the hallmark of cults. Without thought. The followers are without thought. You can't even say, I'm following the man of God as he follows God. Are you? Have you stopped to think about it? What has transpired in your journey in this place that you have just constantly ignored the urgings from within? You've been taught to view those urgings to think for yourself as being the devil. And the opposite is true. You were given a conscience, right? You have a conscience. You have a heart. You have even intuition. And we stepped on that, ignored it, pushed it down. How far have you strayed? How far have you allowed yourself to stray? The inward man is crying out, ow, my heart hurts, stop. And the man of God says, the word of God requires that you keep going without asking questions, without doubt. That's the devil. Really, does that make sense? That the devil would cry out to stop hurting somebody? To stop having a loving relationship with someone? To break up marriages for the sake of the corporation? Is that what the devil would do? Or would the devil do the opposite? Break up marriages, break up families, break up friendships. Demand that you give more of your time, of your money, and you're never going to live up to it. Never. It's a racket.
And for Milgram, of course, he saw the connection with his own participants. And he said that Arendt's conception of the banality of evil comes closer to the truth than one might dare imagine. The ordinary person who's shocked, the person did so out of a sense of obligation, a conception of his duties as a subject, and not from any peculiarly aggressive tendencies. The core message here then is that tyranny and oppression thrive because perpetrators conform thoughtlessly and mindlessly to authority. If someone asks us to do it, we just get on with it. We don't ask why.
When I got to this part, the light bulb came on. Yes, now I'm really engaged to hear what this guy has to say. So is it just a blind obedience, or is there something else going on, maybe as well?
Now, the question that my colleagues and I, and in particular Steve Reicher at the University of St Andrews, have asked is, might the same process of working towards a leader, or perhaps working towards an experimenter, explain what's going on in the Milgram paradigm and other similar studies? And what I want to do in the time left to me is to suggest that yes, that is indeed what is going on. And our analysis suggests that what underlies participants' willingness to administer shocks is not blind conformity, but actually engaged followership.
Engaged followership. Oh man, yes. And then listen what he has to say further.
In which people respond enthusiastically and with commitment and a certain amount of imagination to not so much the instructions, but the vision of leaders. And there are 4 lines of evidence which really speak to this. and that I'm going to go through very quickly. The first draws on a little known but actually core fact about Milgram's research, which is that he didn't just conduct one study. His program was comprised of around 30. And if you look at those studies, what you see is that the level of obedience that was displayed in them varied dramatically. In some studies, all of the participants were prepared to go all the way to 450 volts, and in some of them, none did. So the obvious question is, what explains this variability? And more particularly, it doesn't seem like a natural process that people just do what they're told, because they were always told the same thing. Instead, they're responsive to some contextual cues. What might those be?
Responding to contextual cues. Let's go. Let's hear more. Let's hear more, Mr. TED Talk guy.
Well, Steve and I, in our research, the starting point was to give people like yourselves details of those variants and ask them to what extent a particular variant encourages participants to identify with the experimenter and their science, their scientific project, or alternatively to identify with the learner. That's variability in obedience across the different variants, from very high to very low. And what you see if you look at patterns of predicted identification with the experimenter is that those map very closely onto those levels of obedience. On the other hand, identification with the learner, the victim, goes in the opposite direction and is negatively correlated with obedience.
Now, at first I was thinking, well, a variant in this scenario with these churches is that there are people that have the relationship with the victim. We'll call them a victim because he did. But the real thing is the connection to the cause of the leader that causes the people. And he's going to go, that causes the people to do what the leader wants them to do. And in the case of a cult, it's regardless of the relationship to the victim.
And again, interestingly, this is something that Milgram's own insights at the time that he was conducting the study suggest was very much going through his own mind. He said, the subjects have come to the laboratory to form a relationship with the experimenter, a specifically submissive relationship in the interest of advancing science.
So the person that showed up to the laboratory came with the desire to form a relationship with the leader, the experimenter, the dude in the white lab coat, for the purpose of helping science. So that can easily be translated to people who come to church and come to a group like House of Prayer, like New Testament Christian Church, and will form a relationship with the preacher because they believe they're in it together to promote the plan, the program, as they use the word, of God. The Great Commission. Their first priority, now in the case of the experiment here, they haven't formed a relationship with the learner, the person on the other side who's receiving the volts. People don't necessarily come to the church. I mean, they want to have fellowship one with another, but their primary allegiance and the person that is running the show, is in charge, is the minister.
They have not come to form a relationship with the victim, and it is this lack of a relationship in the one direction and the real relationship with the experimenter in the other that explains the results. In other words, participants obey, if you want to call it that, we don't actually, but not because they identify with the experimenter and do not identify with the learner.
We've seen many times through the years the blind allegiance to the leaders of the group, really regardless of their bad behavior. Out on FactNet, Awful Behavior by George Jordan and Mike Keckle didn't matter. Keckle he knows he can get up there and Graham pretty much say whatever he wants. and you're not supposed to say anything. You're wrong if you point out his bad behavior. You're wrong. You're evil. You're the evil one, because they have the affinity with the dude in charge.
This is something that we've explored in other research by looking at how people respond to prompts that they're given by the experimenter in the event that they turn out to be reluctant to continue administering shocks. When that happens, the experimenter gives them a series of 4 predetermined prods. The first is, please continue. The second is, the experiment requires that you continue. If they still don't want to go on, he says it's absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, he says you have no other choice, you must continue. Now, what's interesting about that is that of those prods, only one is a direct order. It's the last one. Okay. So if the Milgram studies are about obeying orders, what you should see is that that prod is particularly effective. But actually what you find is exactly the opposite. In Milgram's own research and in replications of it, you find that when that last prod is given, not a single participant obeys it. So when people are told, ordered to do something, they say, no, I'm not going to. So ironically, and it's a pretty profound irony, the one thing that the Milgram studies are understood as showing is the one thing that they don't show. When people are ordered to do something, they actually don't. And this is something that we've looked at in some additional research of ours, in which we've actually controlled the prods more systematically in a sort of rigorous experimental design. And what you see there, again, is that the final prod is particularly unsuccessful. It's not a very good strategy, okay? Why is it unsuccessful? The argument, we suggest, is because it positions the experimenter as someone who is working against or not with the participant. It suggests that they are using power over them rather than engaging in a collaborative, cooperative enterprise. What is the prod that's most successful? Well, it's the one that says the experiment requires that you continue. Why is that successful? Because it appeals to an identity-related activity that the experimenter and the participant share, an interest in advancing science.
An interest in advancing the cause of the gospel. The NTCC version, of course, which is basically a bunch of man-made rules.
This is something in a third stream of research we've investigated by manipulating identification with the experimenter and with science directly. Okay, so we have a control condition, but we also have a high identification condition in which we say to people, list 3 things that you think are important about science, that you like about science, that you have in common with scientists. And we have a low identification condition. List 3 things that you find problematic about science, that you dislike about science, and that differentiate you from scientists. Well, what you see is that in the high identification and like the control condition, actually about 50% of participants go all the way to the final instruction. They show total obedience, if you like. But in the low identification condition, actually their willingness to do so is dramatically reduced. In that condition, only about, or fewer than 10% of people go to the end. Final piece of evidence is, okay, this is conjecture or experimental work after the fact. In recent years, we've gone back into Milgram's archives at Yale to see if there's any sense that what I'm talking about now was what was actually going on there. And what you see, going through Milgram's notebooks, I've given you some of that information already, but also details of the transcripts of the studies and so on, is that actually Milgram, as a sort of leader of the scientific enterprise, went to great lengths to encourage identification on the part of participants with his project.
It's the same thing in the House of Prayer and NTCC. They want you to identify with their high ideals and goals.
So he bigged up the science in order to encourage engagement with his mission, his task, his experimental activities. He spent a very long time honing the shock apparatus, for example, to make it look like a really impressive piece of engineering equipment.
These groups do everything they can to make the atmosphere seem like it's a real, legit church or legit Bible school.
And when the participants turned up to the lab, he gave them a big story about how important what they were doing was for science.
Followers get a big story about how important it is, what they're doing is to the call of God, the commission of God, the good news, the gospel. And that's why they want your obedience.
But actually we know very little about the effect of punishment on learning, he said, because almost no truly scientific studies have been made of it in human beings. So by participating in this research, you're doing a great thing for science. And this is, I think, the most telling piece of evidence that we've uncovered. It's in box 44 in the Milgram archive, which is there's masses of material, and it is the transcripts of participants' post-experimental responses. How did they feel when they found at the end of the study that they had actually been prepared to kill somebody in the name of science? Well, everybody here thinks they must have felt like, well, pretty crappy, okay? That must have been a terrible thing, and they must have been embarrassed, to say the least, but they might have felt pretty rotten. Well, actually, far from it. Because what you see there is that participants weren't really distressed at all. On the contrary, they were actually pretty happy. Why? Because in the brief debriefing, Milgram had explained to them that they had made a major contribution.
I thought that was amazing to find out that this guy went into the archives and found all the things that Milgram said afterwards, and what he said to these participants was to praise them for advancing science by participating, so thereby wiping out any stress they had, whatever they felt during the experiment, whatever fear, distress, pressure they had, feelings of horror at what they were doing to somebody. Milgram nullified all that by giving them a pat on the back for their participation in the project to advance science. And the same thing happens in these cult groups. You are praised for having gone along with it. Yes, as Jerry and Fausto said in that one service, it doesn't feel good, it's not easy, but you have to do it. You have to do it for the greater good. It's what God wants you to do. It's right in his word. You saw it. I put it up on the screen. You saw it. You read it for yourself, right? No, that's not what they read. What he said to them was, when someone says something against your church, against the church you believe in, against the ministry you're following, that is not in the Bible. So on the one hand, you have these extremist groups that are lying, using the Bible that people believe in, and you have Milgram here being honest at the end that he was conducting an experiment and praising these people. But it wiped out what they were feeling in the moment. So they had no regret, did they? They believed a man passed out. They believed a man almost died. They believed a man who had heart trouble almost died. And that in that moment when they were feeling that, it was all wiped away when Milgram said, thank them for their good work. And it's the same thing. In the moment, while people are still in the mindset of the cult, they have no regret because they've been given the attaboy, the attagirl, the pat on the back, the praise, maybe even given things, maybe even given special privileges. And so it wipes out what they were feeling at the moment when they were mistreating people and cutting off ties with loved ones. They praise them for doing the right thing, for putting God first in their life by destroying the lives of these other people, by cutting off ties to your family and your close friends. It is the same thing. To me, that just opened it all up for me. it wasn't just blind obedience. It's because they had explained to them that there was this higher purpose and goal. In tyrannical situations, with dictators and all, it's the same thing. What's presented to the people is this high goal, is this high and lofty goal that they're all working towards, and that you did your part and you're advancing this great thing. And in the case of these two extremist groups, cults, it's the gospel.
To science through their efforts, and they had the sense that they had made this big contribution to a cutting-edge piece of science. More particularly, rather than thinking, I've done something wrong, Milgram in his debriefing explained to them that they'd actually done a wonderful thing, and they had no sense of having done anything wrong. Yes, delivering shocks to other people was unpleasant, and at the time they would rather not have had to do it, but ultimately they felt happy because through their willingness to stick with the task, they had proved themselves to be worthy, good subjects. This is one participant's response. Briefly, I am happy to have been of service. The money was donated to the Cancer Fund. You see, my interest lay in being of service. Continue your experiments by all means, as long as good can come of them. In this crazy mixed up world of ours, every bit of good is needed. So the participants, far from thinking they'd done something terrible, thought they'd done something wonderful.
This resonates, this correlates perfectly.
That is frightening.
I'm going to echo this as well, to just punch it, to just send it right home, I hope, into your heart. Like, it is frightening. It is frightening.
That is shocking. And actually that, I think, is the most alarming element of Milgram's research.
I've watched the House of Prayer videos where, I'm telling you, some of these people are just troopers to go out there with the bullhorns and to call out to their loved ones. Their loved ones are in there. Their sons, daughters, husbands, wives, friends. And calling to them. And those people show signs of just contempt and in delight and happiness. They feel they're doing something good. I'll say this. I don't know that they feel that. They show that. Why did they restrain Dennis's wife, Marjorie, and his daughter? Why does Kekel Kinson get up there in Fausto, in the pulpit, and tell people at conferences, tell people in Graham, put it out there on a live stream? They don't even care to go ahead and shun and have nothing to do with people who did absolutely zero wrong, except hurt their ability to earn money and to be revered. That's it. That's it, folks.
So to conclude, what I want to say is tyranny isn't a product of natural or blind obedience. This is something that Milgram himself recognized. Even in this experiment, we must disguise the character of obedience so that it appears to serve a productive end.
That it appears to serve a productive end. Doesn't that describe it perfectly?
Therefore, we are not dealing with blind obedience, he said. It's ironic, of course, that he wrote that in his notebooks, and that's absolutely not what people understand his research as saying. Indeed, it probably isn't obedience at all. Rather, it's engaged followership that's predicated upon identification with those in authority, whose cause is believed to be right, and who are followed on this basis. And the final point there then is, if you look at tyranny around the world, what makes people willing to abuse, to tyrannize, to oppress, to torture other people? Well, the first thing to note is it is very hard work. It requires energy, application, and enthusiasm. It isn't something that you sleepwalk into like a zombie. No, it's hard work, and ultimately, perpetrators are people who do what they do because they see it to be a labor of love.
And I'll end it with that. I think it's a labor of love. And that's exactly what it is in NTCC and HOP. And there is one more connection between the two groups, especially since Dennis learned it from Davis.